She was 25, and for all intents and purposes, homeless. After the rail yard closed her late husband's account, there was no family, no money, and no plan. Just a small, hand-forged steel bird in her pocket, and the $3 that constituted her final pay. And with that $3, she bought an abandoned, welded-shut boxcar, sitting on a forgotten spur of track outside Laramie, Wyoming. But what nobody in that dusty rail town knew, what no one could have guessed, was that sealed inside that rusted iron shell was a secret 40 years old, a secret that would change her life forever. So settle in and stay close. Let us know where you're watching from tonight as we tell the story of Clara Harrow and the $3 boxcar. Clara had not been born to the railroad, but she had been made by it. She arrived in Wyoming at 19, a girl from a hard-luck Ohio farm where the soil gave out before the people did. She was promised a position as a laundress for a hotel, but the position had been filled months before her coach even crossed the Platte River. It was Liam Harrow who found her, sitting on her trunk at the depot, not crying but staring at the far-off mountains with a look of grim appraisal, as if measuring them for a fitting. He was a yard machinist for the Union Pacific, a man with grease ground into the lines of his hands and a quiet kindness in his eyes. He saw not a lost girl, but a fellow survivor. He bought her a meal, and then another, and within 6 months they were married, living in a small 2-room house in the company town that huddled in the shadow of the great repair shops. Liam was her mentor in the ways of this new world. He taught her the language of the yard, the difference between a highball and a deadhead, the meaning of the whistle codes that echoed through the valley day and night. He brought home scrap metal, shards of boilerplate, sheared bolts, flawed castings, and explained the nature of their failures, the subtle signs of stress and fatigue in iron and steel. He taught her to read the railroad's own dense literature, timetables, freight manifests, and the company ledgers where men's lives were entered as debits and credits. She had a quick mind for it, a head for numbers and patterns that surprised him. While other wives complained of the soot and the noise, Clara learned to find the rhythm in it, the great, pulsing, mechanical heartbeat of the nation. For a wedding gift, Liam had forged her a small bird from a piece of high-quality Damascus steel, its wings upswept, its body layered with the subtle, watery patterns of the folded metal. It was impossibly delicate for such a strong material, a perfect thing born of fire and skill. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned, and she carried it in her apron pocket always, a cool, solid weight against her thigh. Their life was not easy, but it was theirs. It was a life measured in paydays and steam pressure, in the scent of hot oil and the shrill call of the shop whistle. It was a life built on the unyielding certainty of iron, a certainty that shattered the day Liam was caught between 2 shunting cars, his life extinguished as quick and final as a snuffed lantern. The end of her life with the railroad came not with a bang, but with a piece of paper. A week after she buried Liam in the small, windswept cemetery overlooking the yard, a man from the company office knocked on her door. His name was Mr. Davies, and he wore a suit that was too clean for the grit-laced air of the town. He did not remove his hat. He handed her a thin envelope containing Liam's final pay, $33, and a second folded document. It was a notice of eviction. Her right to company housing, he explained without a trace of sympathy, had terminated upon the closing of Foreman Harrow's account. The house was needed for a new family, a living worker's family. He spoke as if reading from a manual, his voice devoid of inflection. Clara stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her, and simply nodded. She did not plead or argue. She had watched the company for 6 years. She knew it was as deaf and unyielding as a granite cliff. Arguing with Mr. Davies would be like shouting at a locomotive. He was not a man. He was a function, a gear in the vast machine that had consumed her husband and was now casting her out. After he left, she stood in the center of the small room, the eviction notice cool in her hand. The air was thick with the scent of Liam, of oil and metal, and the faint, sweet smell of the pipe tobacco he smoked in the evenings. She looked at the sturdy furniture he had built, the shelf of books he had been so proud of, the worn spot on the floor where he sat to pull off his boots. These things were no longer hers. They belonged to the house, and the house belonged to the company. She spent $30 of her $33 to have Liam's tools, his most prized possessions, crated and shipped to his brother in California. It was what he would have wanted. Then, she began to pack. It did not take long. She had a small trunk for her clothes, a sewing box with her needles and threads, and the heavy cast-iron Singer sewing machine her own mother had given her. She wrapped it carefully in blankets, her most valuable and practical asset. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows from the smokestacks, she swept the floor one last time, closed the door behind her without looking back, and walked away from the only home she had known as a married woman, her worldly possessions loaded onto a borrowed handcart. She did not cry. The time for tears was a private thing, and her grief was her own, not a spectacle for the company's pity. She had $3 left, and the small steel bird in her pocket. Her journey was not one of miles, but of feet, a slow, grinding passage from the heart of the company town to its frayed edges. She pushed the handcart herself, the iron wheels groaning over the cinder-strewn ground. Every turn of the wheels was an act of will. The cart was heavy with the weight of her sewing machine, a dense anchor of self-reliance. She passed the neat rows of identical houses, each with its small patch of yard, and felt the shift in the air. Windows that had once held friendly faces now held curtains that twitched and fell still. The women she had shared coffee with, whose children she had patched clothes for, now looked away, their faces tight with a mixture of pity and fear. Clara's fate was a chilling reminder of their own precarity. They were all just one accident, one illness, one pink slip away from the same walk. The men, coming off their shifts, grimy and exhausted, tipped their hats with a new kind of solemnity, their eyes holding a respectful distance. She was no longer one of them. She was a widow, a loose piece of driftwood in the powerful current of the railroad. The familiar sounds of the yard, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the hiss of steam, the deafening roar of a locomotive passing on the main line, seemed different now, alien and menacing. The place that had been the backdrop of her life, the source of her security, was now just a landscape of noise and industry that had no place for her. She pushed on, past the machine shops and the roundhouse, its dark maw swallowing and disgorging engines. She followed the tracks out to the sprawling salvage yard, a graveyard of iron where the railroad's broken things were left to rust. Piles of bent rails lay like fallen giants. Mountains of shattered ties bled creosote into the soil. Here, on the literal and social margins of the town, an auction was scheduled for the following morning, a place where the unwanted was sold for pennies on the dollar. She found a sheltered spot behind a wall of discarded boilerplates, the metal still radiating a faint warmth from the day's sun. She unrolled her blanket, ate a piece of dry bread she had saved, and sat with her back against the cold iron. The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and purple. The temperature began to drop. From her vantage point, she could see the entire town lit up below, a constellation of warm, yellow lights. Each light was a home, a family, a life she was no longer a part of. She pulled her shawl tighter, her hand closing around the steel bird in her pocket. It was cold, but its familiar weight was a comfort, a tangible link to a time when she had belonged. She was an outsider now, adrift in a sea of iron and indifference. Her past was a closed account. Her future was a terrifying blank. All she had was the present moment, the grit under her thin blanket, and the $3 that stood between her and absolute destitution. The morning of the auction dawned cold and clear, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. The salvage yard was already stirring with activity. Men with calculating eyes and calloused hands moved through the lots, kicking at piles of scrap, assessing the value of decay. They were scrap dealers, handymen, and ranchers, men who knew how to turn one man's trash into their own treasure. Clara stood apart, a small, still figure in a dark dress, easily overlooked. She watched and listened, her face impassive. The auctioneer, a stout man with a booming voice and a stained waistcoat, climbed onto a flatbed car and began his rapid-fire patter. He sold off lots of rail spikes, kegs of rusted bolts, and stacks of lumber salvaged from a collapsed trestle. The bidding was brisk, but low. These were men who knew the value of $1. Clara stayed her hand, waiting. Her $3 felt impossibly small, a child's allowance in a world of men's commerce. Then, the auctioneer pointed to the end of the line, at a single boxcar sitting alone on a disconnected spur of track, weeds growing up around its silent wheels. "All right, gentlemen," he boomed, "Lot 47. One standard 40-foot boxcar, sold as is, where is?" A murmur went through the small crowd. The car was a strange beast. Its sides were thick with rust, the original painted lettering of a long-defunct railway, barely visible beneath the corrosion. But its most peculiar feature was the door. It had been welded shut, not with a few tacks of metal, but with thick, ugly seams of iron running the entire height of the doors on both sides. A few men walked over, rapping their knuckles against the steel. It rang with a dull, solid thud. "What's the story on it, Charlie?" one of the dealers called out. The auctioneer shrugged. "Came in on a transfer 40 years ago. Paperwork got lost, bill of lading was missing. The company sealed it to secure the contents against a claim, and then the claim never came. Been sitting here ever since. We can't open it, and we can't move it without a crane. We're selling the car, and whatever might, or might not, be inside. Scrap value only." A laugh went through the crowd. It was a pig in a poke, a fool's gamble. It could be loaded with valuable goods, or it could be filled with rocks, or most likely, it was completely empty. A hollow iron shell that would cost more to cut apart than the scrap was worth. "Let's start the bidding at $5 for the scrap," the auctioneer said. Silence. $4? Still silence. The men were looking at it now with disdain. It was a problem, not an opportunity. "All right, who'll give me $3 for the trouble of looking at it?" the auctioneer said, his voice edged with impatience. Before the laughter could start, a quiet voice cut through the air. $3. Every head turned. Clara stood with her chin up, her gaze fixed on the auctioneer. The men stared, first in disbelief, then with amusement. The widow Harrow, buying a welded-shut boxcar? The auctioneer blinked, surprised, sold. He barked, slamming his gavel onto a crate. "To the lady in black, for $3. He took her money, scribbled a receipt on a piece of paper, and the auction moved on. The men gave her a wide berth, some shaking their heads in pity, others smirking at her foolishness. But Clara didn't see them. She was looking at the boxcar. It was hers, a useless, rusted, sealed iron box that nobody wanted, an object as lost and isolated as she was. She owned a boxcar she could not enter. For 2 days, she lived in its shadow, a squatter on her own property. She used her sewing skills to mend clothes for a few of the section hands' wives in exchange for food, a loaf of bread, a handful of potatoes, a jar of milk. The women were kind, but their pity was a heavy blanket she did not want. At night, she slept under the massive, silent bulk of the car, listening to the wind sigh through the rusted undercarriage. She spent hours studying it, walking its length, running her hands over the coarse, flaking rust, and the brutal, thick welds. There were no visible markings to indicate its contents, only the ghost of a name: Allegheny and Western Freight. Her husband Liam had spoken of the smaller lines that the Union Pacific had swallowed up decades ago, their rolling stock absorbed or abandoned. This car was a relic from that earlier time. It was clear she could not open it alone. The welds were too thick, the steel too solid. She needed fire, and a strong arm. There was only one man in town with the skill and the tools for such a job: George Pike, the railroad blacksmith. He was a widower himself, a large, quiet man who had kept to his forge since his wife's passing 5 years prior. He was known for his skill, his honesty, and his preference for the company of iron over people. Gathering her courage, Clara walked from the salvage yard to the smithy, a journey that took her back into the heart of the town. The smithy was a dark, cavernous building, smelling of coal smoke, hot metal, and horse. George Pike was at the anvil, his face illuminated by the glowing heart of the forge, his hammer blows ringing with a powerful, steady rhythm. He was shaping a new drawbar, his movements economical and precise. He didn't stop when she entered, finishing the heat before placing the glowing metal aside and turning to her, wiping his hands on a leather apron. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue in his soot-stained face. "Mrs. Harrow," he said. His voice was a low rumble. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Pike, I have a business proposition for you." She explained the situation plainly: the boxcar, the welded doors, her lack of funds. "I can't pay you in cash," she finished, her voice steady, "but I will give you half of the scrap value of the car, and half of anything inside, if you will help me open it." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He knew, as everyone in town knew, of her circumstances. He could have taken pity, offered charity. But she had offered a bargain, a partnership. He walked over to a wall of tools, selecting a heavy cold chisel and a 10-pound sledgehammer. "Let's go have a look," he said. They walked back to the boxcar in silence. He spent almost an hour examining the welds, tapping them with a hammer, listening to the sound. He scraped away rust, looking for a weakness. Finally, he nodded, more to himself than to her. "It's a brute of a job," he said, "but it was done by a man in a hurry. The welds are thick, but they're ugly. Not enough heat. I think I can break the seam." The work took the better part of the day. George used a portable forge to heat a section of the weld cherry red. Then, with Clara holding the massive chisel steady with a pair of long tongs, he swung the sledgehammer. The impact was immense, a deafening clang that vibrated through the ground. Again and again he swung, the rhythm of his blows a testament to his strength and endurance. Sweat poured down his face. Slowly, agonizingly, a hairline crack appeared in the weld. He worked his way down the seam, heat and hammer, heat and hammer. Finally, with the sun low in the sky, he drove a wedge into the fractured seam. With a final, mighty blow, the weld gave way with a screech of tortured metal. The heavy door, freed from its 40-year prison, groaned and shifted. Together, they put their shoulders to it. It moved an inch, then a foot, rolling back into the dark interior. A wave of cool, still, dry air washed over them, smelling faintly of dust, old wood, and something else, canvas and oil. They peered into the gloom. It was not empty. The interior of the boxcar was a time capsule. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the open door, they saw not a chaotic jumble of scrap, but a space that was meticulously, purposefully packed. Stacks of wooden crates stood lashed to the walls, their stenciled markings still crisp and black. Long, canvas-wrapped bundles were secured overhead in netting. Barrels stood in neat rows, their lids sealed with wax. In the center of the car, bolted to the floor, was a small, sturdy oak desk and a matching chair. And on the desk sat a single object, a large, leather-bound ledger, its cover coated in a fine, undisturbed layer of dust. George Pike let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, his voice full of something like reverence. He reached back to the forge and lit a lantern, the warm yellow light pushing back the shadows and revealing the full extent of the treasure. It was a rolling warehouse, frozen in time. Clara stepped up into the car, her feet silent on the dusty floorboards. She ran a hand over the nearest crate. The wood was dry and sound. The stencil read, HD & Co. Hardware, Pittsburgh, PA, She moved to the next, which bore the mark of a New England textile mill. George followed with the lantern, his big frame filling the space. He picked up a small crowbar that was hanging from a hook on the wall, and, with a questioning look at Clara, gestured to the nearest crate. She nodded. With a squeal of nails, he gently pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in straw, were dozens of brand-new handsaws, their steel blades gleaming, their wooden handles smooth and unblemished. They were packed in cosmoline, a thick rust preventing grease that had preserved them perfectly. They opened another crate. It was full of hammers, their heads stamped with a maker's mark she'd never seen. Another held planes, and another, boxes of nails in every size. The canvas bundles held bolts of heavy wool and durable cotton duck, the fabric as fresh as the day it was woven. The barrels contained lanterns, wicks and all, and tins of kerosene, lamp oil, and linseed oil, all sealed and sound. It was a fortune. Not a fortune in gold, but in practical, essential things. Tools, fabric, hardware, the very materials needed to build a life, a home, a town. This wasn't a lost shipment. It was a general store on wheels. Clara felt a dizzying sense of disbelief. She walked to the small desk, the island of order in this sea of provision. She wiped the dust from the ledger with her sleeve and opened it. The first page was written in a neat, elegant hand. It was not a bill of lading, but a letter. To whomever finds this car, it began. My name is Silas Croft. I was the freight agent for the Allegheny and Western Line in the year 1852. This car and its contents were my charge, and my story is tied to them. Clara and George exchanged a look. He moved the lantern closer, its light falling on the page. She began to read aloud, her voice soft in the still, heavy air of the boxcar. The letter told a story of ambition and tragedy. Silas Croft had been sent west to establish a new freight depot at a planned junction. He had invested his own life savings, everything he had, into purchasing the initial stock, the goods now filling the car around them. He was a widower, and his hope was to build a new life for himself and his young daughter. But the railroad, in its infinite and careless wisdom, had changed its plans. The junction was moved 50 miles to the south. Silas's depot, and the small town that had begun to grow around it, was left stranded. The railroad refused to compensate him for the goods they would no longer ship. Trapped, with his life's work rendered worthless, he had sealed the car, a desperate act to protect his property from local scavengers, while he went east to plead his case with the company directors. He had left a final, heartbreaking entry. I leave this record and these goods in the hope that they might one day fall into the hands of someone in need of a new start, as I was. The manifest within this ledger is complete. There is also a map, and a copy of a land claim for the quarter section where the depot was to be built, a claim the railroad company never bothered to file or contest. It has a good well. Perhaps it will be of use to you. I am going to fetch my daughter Eleanor from her grandmother's care. I cannot imagine what future we have, but I cannot leave her behind. A small, carved wooden horse fell from between the pages as Clara turned to the manifest. It was worn smooth, clearly a child's toy. Silas Croft had never returned. Researching it later, they would find the record of a steamboat disaster on the Missouri River that year. Silas and his daughter Eleanor were on the passenger list. He had not abandoned his post. He had been lost to the river, another life erased by the heedless expansion of the nation. The boxcar, and the hope it contained, had simply been forgotten. Until now. The ledger was more than a record of loss. It was a blueprint for reclamation. For the next week, the boxcar became Clara and George's world. They worked from sunrise to sunset, a quiet, efficient team. The first task was to create a complete inventory, cross-referencing the physical goods with Silas Croft's meticulous entries. Clara sat at the small oak desk, the ledger open before her, a pen and a fresh notebook at her side. Her skill with numbers and her tidy, precise handwriting were perfectly suited to the task. George, with his brute strength and gentle hands, would open a crate or a barrel, call out the contents, and then carefully reseal it. 24 brace and bit sets, he would call, his voice echoing slightly in the long metal room. Marked Stanley rule and level. 24 brace and bit sets, Clara would repeat, her pen scratching across the paper. Stanley rule and level. Check. They developed a rhythm, a wordless dance of shared work. The process was slow and methodical, a kind of archaeology. Each item they unpacked was a connection to the past, a piece of Silas Croft's failed dream. They found boxes of fine china, carefully packed in barrels of sawdust. They found school primers and slates, evidence of his hope for a community. They even found a crate containing a small, ornate cast-iron stove, a model designed for a small home, not a rough frontier cabin. As she worked, Clara felt a growing kinship with the man who had written the ledger. She admired his foresight, the quality of the goods he had chosen, and the neatness of his records. He was a man who believed in order and quality, just as Liam had. This was not the work of a fool, but of a careful, hopeful planner betrayed by forces beyond his control. The most important document was tucked into a sleeve in the back of the ledger, the land claim. It was for a quarter section, 160 acres, and it was marked with the location of a hand-dug well. Attached was a hand-drawn map showing the property in relation to the old, abandoned A&W survey line. George, who had prospected in the hills in his youth, studied the map intently. "I know this place," he said, his finger tracing a faint line that marked a creek. "It's about 5 miles north of town. The railroad survey is long gone, but the creek is still there. They call it Cottonwood Draw. Nobody ever settled it. Too far from the main line, the land itself was worthless without the water right, but the claim, if it could be proven, granted ownership of the well, the only reliable water source for miles. The Union Pacific owned most of the land, but this small parcel, through a bureaucratic oversight 40 years old, had never been officially absorbed. It was a ghost on the map, a legal loophole big enough to drive a boxcar through. Their plan began to form, solidifying over mugs of coffee brewed on a small fire outside the car. The goods were valuable, but the land claim was the real prize. It offered a foundation, a place to stand that wasn't owned by the railroad. To claim it, however, they would need to prove a chain of title. The boxcar, its contents, and the ledger were her proof. Clara Harrow, the penniless widow, was now the heir to a 40-year-old promise. Her rebuilding would not be with wood and nails, but with paper and ink, with the careful, patient reconstruction of a dead man's legal rights. The railroad had cast her out, but an older, forgotten railroad had just given her a weapon. The first sign that their discovery had been noticed came in the form of Mr. Davies. He arrived at the salvage yard late one afternoon, his clean suit looking even more out of place amidst the rust and iron than it had at Clara's door. He did not approach the boxcar directly, but stood at a distance, watching as George loaded sorted hardware back into a crate. George saw him first, a subtle stiffening of his shoulders. Clara looked up from her ledger. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice calm and even. He walked forward, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. "Mrs. Harrow, I see you've made a curious investment." His eyes scanned the organized interior of the car, the neat stacks of inventory lists on the desk. His condescending smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of sharp, acquisitive interest. "The company has an interest in historical assets," he began, his tone smooth and reasonable. "This car, being from a defunct line, is technically an artifact. We would be prepared to offer you a fair price for it, to save you the trouble of disposing of it. Say, $50? It was 10 times what she'd paid, a significant sum. A month ago, it would have been a lifeline. Now, it was an insult. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Davies," Clara said, not looking up from her papers. "But it is not for sale." Davies's smile tightened. Perhaps you don't understand. This is company property. You are trespassing. George Pike set down the crate he was holding with a heavy thud. He was not a tall man, but he was broad, and his silence was more intimidating than any threat. "The lady holds a bill of sale," George said, his voice a low rumble. "Signed by your own auctioneer. She owns the car and its contents. We're on salvage land, not company track." Davies's gaze shifted to George, and he seemed to shrink a little. He was a man of paper and rules. George was a man of iron and fire. They were different species. "This is not over," Davies hissed, and turned on his heel, striding away. The encounter solidified their partnership. George was no longer just a hired hand, he was a defender. The community, which had first pitied and then ignored Clara, began to stir. News of the treasure car spread through town. People would walk out to the salvage yard on Sunday afternoons, staring at the boxcar as if it were a visiting circus. But a few came closer. First was Mr. Henderson, the grocer, a kind, elderly man who had always slipped an extra apple into Clara's bag. He offered the use of his dry cellar to store the fabrics and other perishable goods, protecting them from the damp and the mice. "No charge," he said, waving off her thanks. "Call it a loan. Good for the town to have a little mystery." Next came Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, a woman who knew everyone's business. She brought them a hot meal of stew and cornbread, and while they ate, she provided a detailed history of the railroad's land dealings in the area, information gleaned from years of sorting mail and overhearing conversations. She confirmed that the Cottonwood Draw parcel was a legal anomaly, a piece of land everyone knew about but no one could touch. A young lawyer, fresh from the East and eager to make a name for himself, heard the story and offered his services. Intrigued by the legal challenge, he spent an evening in the boxcar, poring over the ledger and the claim map by lantern light, his excitement growing with each page. "This is magnificent," he breathed. "This is a perfect chain of evidence." Clara's rebuilding was becoming a community project. Each person brought their own skill, their own piece of the puzzle: storage, information, legal counsel. They were drawn not just by the prospect of a fight with the powerful railroad, but by the quiet dignity of the work itself. They saw Clara not as a victim, but as a strategist, and George not as a simple blacksmith, but as a guardian. The boxcar was no longer just a container of goods. It was becoming a symbol of quiet defiance, a rallying point for the town's own forgotten hopes. The filing of the land claim at the county courthouse was a quiet affair, a matter of ink and paper, but it sent shockwaves through the railroad's local headquarters. Clara, accompanied by George and her young lawyer, presented the original claim document from Silas Croft's ledger, along with the bill of sale for the boxcar and a signed affidavit from the auctioneer. The county clerk, a man who had been bullied by the railroad's lawyers for years, stamped the documents with a grim satisfaction. The Union Pacific responded as expected, with a team of lawyers from Omaha who descended on the town like a flock of crows. They tried to have the claim dismissed, arguing that it was ancient and invalid. But Clara's lawyer was prepared. He argued that the claim had been sealed and preserved, its chain of title unbroken, by the railroad's own actions. By welding the car shut, the company had inadvertently created a perfect, tamper-proof vessel for Silas Croft's legal rights. The railroad's second tactic was to try and buy her out. Mr. Davies appeared again, this time with a much larger offer, enough money to set her up comfortably for life. He cornered her outside the general store, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "Take the money, Mrs. Harrow. You cannot win this fight. The company has endless resources. We can keep this tied up in court for years, until you have nothing left." Clara looked at him, her expression calm. "This isn't about money, Mr. Davies. It's about the land." She had come to understand that the 160 acres and its well represented something more than their monetary value. It was a chance to put down roots, to build something that could not be taken away by a ledger entry in a distant office. The fight over the land claim became the town's central drama. Support for Clara grew. The local newspaper, which usually kowtowed to the railroad, ran a front-page story detailing the history of Silas Croft and the ghost car, painting Clara as a plucky heroine. When the railroad tried to get a court order to seize the boxcar as evidence, George organized a group of men from the town, shopkeepers, ranchers, and even some off-duty railroad workers, who stood guard around the car day and night. They brought lanterns and coffee, their silent presence a clear message to the company. Clara, in the meantime, had transformed the boxcar into a place of business. With George's help, she built shelves and a counter. She was no longer living in the shadow of her property. She was inhabiting it. She began to sell the goods, not as a clearance, but as a merchant. The women of the town, tired of the limited and overpriced selection at the company store, flocked to her for quality fabric, needles, and thread. The men came for the superior tools, the likes of which hadn't been seen in Laramie for years. She was a fair trader, setting her prices based on the old manifest, and she quickly earned a reputation for honesty. She was no longer poor widow Harrow. She was Clara, the proprietor of the Boxcar Mercantile. People knew her name. They sought her out. Her small corner of the salvage yard became a new center of commerce, a place of quiet industry humming with a life of its own. George was a constant presence, his smithy now unofficially relocated to the area beside the car. He repaired wagons and sharpened plows, the ring of his anvil providing a steady rhythm to their days. Their partnership, forged in the fire of his forge and the ink of her ledger, had settled into a comfortable, unspoken affection. They were building a life together, one transaction, one hammer blow at a time. The court, swayed by public opinion and the undeniable weight of the evidence, eventually ruled in her favor. The land was hers. Clara stood in the doorway of the small, solid house they had built on the land at Cottonwood Draw. The house was made of stone cleared from the property and timber from the small grove of cottonwoods that gave the creek its name. It was not a large house, just 2 rooms and a deep porch, but it was sturdy, and it was theirs. From the porch, she could see the boxcar. George had moved it from the salvage yard with a team of 20 horses and a crew of volunteers from the town. It now rested on a permanent foundation of stone pillars, its wheels removed, its body cleaned of rust and given a fresh coat of protective black paint. It served as a dry, secure storeroom and workshop. The Boxcar Mercantile sign painted in neat white letters above the door that George had rehung on smooth, new hinges. The sun was setting, and the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them to gold. In her right hand, she held the small steel bird Liam had forged for her so long ago. Its edges were worn smooth from the years she had carried it in her pocket. It was a relic of a past life, a life of love and loss, but it was a part of her story. On the stone mantelpiece inside the house, next to a vase of wildflowers, sat a small, carved wooden horse. It was Silas Croft's daughter's toy, found between the pages of the ledger. It was a relic of another's hope, another's loss. The 2 objects, the steel bird and the wooden horse, seemed to speak to each other across the room. A silent conversation about fathers and daughters, husbands and wives, and the love that endures even after its objects are gone. Liam had taught her to see the world with clear eyes, to understand the nature of things. Silas had given her a map and a means. Both men, strangers to each other, separated by decades, had provided her with the tools she needed to survive and then to build. She heard the familiar, rhythmic sound of a hammer on steel and looked toward the new smithy George had built near the creek. He was finishing his last job of the day, his silhouette dark against the fiery glow of the forge. His presence was as solid and reliable as the anvil he worked on. Theirs was not a romance of grand declarations, but of shared labor and quiet companionship. It was in the way he kept her woodbox full, the way she made sure there was a hot meal waiting when he finished his work. It was in the easy silence that fell between them as they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars appear in the vast Wyoming sky. It was a love built on a foundation of mutual respect, as solid as the stone of their house. Clara Harrow was 25 and had $3 to her name. She had been a widow with no prospects, a ghost in her own life. She spent it on a rusted boxcar no one wanted. It was the best $3 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story, for sitting with Clara in the quiet and the uncertainty. Her journey reminds us that value is often hidden, waiting not for a hero, but for someone with the patience to look. If you found a measure of peace in Clara's victory, a sense of rightness in the ringing of George's anvil, we hope you'll subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone else who appreciates a quiet strength and a victory earned through hard work and clear sight. It helps these stories find the people who need them. And as you go about your day, we'd love for you to consider a question and perhaps share your thoughts in the comments below. What is the most valuable thing you have ever found? Not because you were searching for treasure, but simply because you were the only one willing to stop and truly see what was there. We often find that the best things in life are not the things that glitter, but the things that endure. The things that, like Clara's boxcar, hold within them the quiet, sturdy promise of a new beginning, waiting for the right hands to come along and unlock their potential. The world is full of such locked boxes, in salvage yards and in our own hearts. It just takes a little courage, and perhaps a partner with a strong hammer and a steady hand to see what's inside. Until next time, be well, and look for the value in the things others have left behind. What would you do if the world decided you had nothing? If the men who ran your town, men who shook your father's hand at church and praised his hard work, gathered in a dusty room to declare that his life's labor, your only inheritance, was a clerical error. For Dora Mercer, this was not a question. It was the sharp, metallic taste of reality on a cold Dakota morning. They took it all with a vote, a stroke of a pen, and a smug, pitying smile. Her father's claim, the small but prosperous homestead at the edge of town, was suddenly, irrevocably, not hers. But what happened next, in the forgotten ruins just beyond the last gravestone, would unearth a truth buried deeper than any coffin. A truth that would rewrite the history of the town that had cast her out. So settle in and stay close. The story of Dora Mercer is a reminder that the things we dismiss as worthless often hold the very key to our salvation. Dora stood on the warped planks of the boardwalk, the council's verdict still ringing in her ears like a struck bell. The paper in her hand, a formal notice of eviction, trembled, though the air was still. 24 hours. That was the grace they had afforded her. 24 hours to erase 20 years of life, of sunup to sundown, work her father, Thomas Mercer, had poured into that plot of land. Mr. Corvid, the council president, and a man whose ambition was as wide as his waistcoat, had delivered the news with a performance of solemn regret. A tragedy, Miss Mercer, he'd said, his voice slick with false sympathy, a deep and regrettable oversight in the original filings. The land, it seems, was never officially ceded from the territorial registry. It reverts to public domain. For the good of the township, of course. The good of the township. Dora had heard that phrase her whole life. It was the justification for every tax, every ordinance, every land grab that benefited men like Corvid. She looked from the paper to the faces of the people passing by. Some offered furtive, pitying glances before hurrying on their way, afraid to be associated with her bad fortune. Others, the ones who had been jealous of her father's success, wore a look of quiet satisfaction. She was no longer one of them. She was an obstacle removed, a piece of unclaimed property. A memory of her father flashed in her mind, sharp as a shard of glass. He was standing by the new fence post he'd just set, his face weathered and kind. "This land, Dora," he'd said, sweeping a calloused hand toward the horizon. "It's not just dirt and grass. It's a promise. It's your future." Now, that future felt like a handful of dust blown away by a cruel wind. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury, a currency she couldn't afford. Instead, a cold, hard resolve settled in her bones. She turned her back on the town hall and walked, not toward her home, it wasn't her home anymore, but toward the livery. She had one thing they hadn't taken, because they hadn't thought it worth taking. Solomon, her father's old mule. He was a stubborn gray beast, as old and weathered as the land itself, but loyal. He watched her approach with intelligent, knowing eyes, his long ears twitching. She hitched him to the small, sturdy wagon that had been her father's. It was all she had left of him. Really, the mule, the wagon, and a handful of personal effects she could gather in a few hours. The packing was a silent, methodical ritual of grief. Her mother's quilt, her father's tools, their wooden handles worn smooth by his grip, a tin of flour, a side of bacon, a bag of coffee. Each object was a ghost, a memory of a life that had been hers just that morning. She worked with a grim efficiency, ignoring the ache in her chest. As the sun began to dip below the prairie, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers, she climbed onto the wagon seat. She didn't look back at the house. She couldn't. She clucked her tongue, and Solomon, with a sigh that seemed to echo her own, pulled the wagon forward. They moved slowly through the town, a pariah in a funeral procession for a life that was not yet over. The warm yellow light of lanterns began to appear in windows, little squares of belonging from which she was now excluded. She guided Solomon past the church, past the general store, and then past the cemetery where her father lay. At the edge of the fading light, where the town gave up and the wilderness began, was a silhouette against the bruised purple sky. A collapsed, forgotten shape. It was the one place no one would look for her, the one place no one had any claim to, because it was considered less than nothing. Dora guided the wagon off the rutted track, the wheels bumping over the untamed prairie grass. Solomon snorted, his warm breath fogging in the cooling air, as if questioning her destination. Before them, hunched against the vast, indifferent sky, were the remains of the old survey shack. It was the first structure ever built in this valley, erected by the men who first mapped the territory, long before the town of Redemption was given its name. Now it was little more than a pile of bones, a skeletal ruin of rotted timbers and collapsed sod. The roof had long since given in, and the walls leaned at a drunken, sorrowful angle. To the townspeople it was a ghost, a place of bad luck and forgotten history, useful only as a landmark to tell you when you'd finally left civilization behind. For Dora, tonight, it was a bitter sort of sanctuary. No one would bother her here. No one ever came here. She brought Solomon to a stop a stone's throw from the ruin, the mule's ears drooping as he surveyed their new home. She unhitched him, giving his coarse neck a long, slow rub. "Just for a little while, old boy," she murmured, her voice raspy. The words felt thin and hollow against the rising wind. She built a small fire, the familiar motions a comfort in the encroaching darkness. The flames licked at the dry kindling, a tiny spark of defiance against the vast star-dusted emptiness above. She made coffee in a tin pot, the bitter, smoky smell filling the air. She ate a piece of dry bread, her hunger a dull ache she barely registered. Her entire world had been reduced to this: a mule, a wagon, and a fire on the edge of nowhere. The weight of her loss was a physical presence, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. This was the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. When the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, she took a lantern and walked toward the shack. The light cast long, dancing shadows, making the broken timbers look like grasping limbs. The wind whispered through the gaps in the walls, a low, mournful moan. She pushed aside a hanging plank that might have once been a door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of damp earth and nesting mice. Moonlight streamed through the holes in the roof, illuminating a scene of total dereliction. The floor was just packed dirt, littered with debris. In one corner, the ground seemed to have sunk, causing the few remaining floorboards to buckle and splinter. It looked like a grave, a fitting place, she thought with a humorless twist of her lips. She had inherited a grave. This was it. This was the sum of her father's legacy. A worthless, forgotten ruin on a worthless, forgotten piece of land. The last embers of hope she had been nursing seemed to flicker and die in the cold, damp air of the shack. What could a woman do in a place like this, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of dust? What secret could a forgotten shack possibly hold, except for the ghosts of failure? Is this the end of Dora Mercer's story? A quiet fade into the vast, empty prairie? Or is it just the beginning of something else entirely? Let us know what you would do in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe for more stories of resilience from the frontier. For Dora, the answer she so desperately needed was waiting just beneath her feet. The next morning, a pale, watery sun did little to warm the chill that had settled deep in Dora's bones. Necessity was a harsh master, and it drove her back into redemption. She needed salt for the bacon, a new whetstone for her father's axe. She tied Solomon to the hitching post outside the general store, his presence a quiet, gray reproach to the town's polished horses. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, she saw Mr. Corvid, holding court with 2 other council members. His suit was, as always, immaculate, a dark slash of prosperity against the dusty street. He saw her, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He nudged one of his companions. "Looky here," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Miss Mercer's come down in the world, heard you're homesteading with the gophers out by the boneyard." His companions chuckled, a greasy, sycophantic sound. Dora felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks, but she forced it down. She had learned from her father that some men weren't worth the breath of a reply. She met Corvid's gaze for a single, searing moment, her own eyes as cold and hard as river stones, then turned and entered the store without a word. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. "Too proud to speak?" he called after her. "Pride don't fill a belly, Miss Mercer. Remember that when the winter winds start to blow." The laughter that followed her into the store was sharp and brittle. Inside, the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, suddenly found himself very busy organizing a shelf of canned peaches, his back to her. The whispers of the other customers died down to a strained silence. She was an infection, a contagion of failure they all feared. She made her purchases quickly, her movements stiff and precise. She counted out the coins from her meager purse, acutely aware of the eyes on her. As she stepped back out into the harsh daylight, the world seemed to shrink to the space between the store and her wagon. It was then she saw him. An old man, sitting on a weathered bench across the street, a piece of cottonwood and a knife in his gnarled hands. It was Gideon Vale, a rancher from the high country who came to town only a few times a year. He was a figure of local legend, as much a part of the landscape as the ancient twisted pines on the ridges he called home. He was watching her, not with pity or contempt, but with a steady, appraising gaze. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, faded blue. As Dora moved to untie Solomon, he spoke. His voice was like stones rolling in a dry creek bed, low and rough. Some roots grow deepest in stony ground. He didn't look up from his whittling. The words hung in the air between them, strange and heavy. Dora paused, her hand on Solomon's lead. She didn't know what he meant, what he could possibly mean. It felt like a riddle, or a curse, or a blessing. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in his direction, a silent acknowledgement of something. Then she climbed onto her wagon and drove away. The sound of Corvid's laughter a fading echo, the old man's cryptic sentence a new and unsettling weight in her mind. The journey back to the shack felt different. The mockery from Corvid had been expected, a predictable cruelty. But Gideon Vale's words were a burr under a saddle, an irritant she couldn't ignore. Stony ground. She looked at the ruin as she approached. It was certainly that. The work ahead of her was immense, a mountain of labor just to make the place survivable. She was alone, an outcast with a handful of tools and a cryptic proverb. The task felt impossible. But as she pulled the wagon to a halt, the old man's words echoed again. Deepest, what if he wasn't talking about failure? What if he was talking about strength? The thought was a tiny, fragile seed planted in the barren soil of her despair. She looked at the collapsed shack, not as a grave, but as a challenge. It was stony ground, all right. She would see what kind of roots she could put down. Dora spent the next days in a fury of labor. She was no stranger to hard work. Her father had raised her to be as capable as any son. She started by clearing the area around the shack, her hands becoming raw as she hauled away collapsed timbers, tangled weeds, and the rusted detritus of a forgotten past. Solomon the mule stood tethered nearby, a silent, watchful companion. His occasional snorts and ear flicks a steady, rhythmic commentary on her progress. The sun beat down, turning the Dakota prairie into a shimmering, dusty anvil. Sweat stung her eyes and traced clean paths through the grime on her face. Each shovelful of debris, each stone moved, was an act of defiance. She was not just clearing land, she was clearing the despair from her own heart, replacing it with the simple, honest ache of physical exertion. She was claiming this forgotten place, one handful of dirt at a time. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, a cold wind began to stir from the north. It carried the first real bite of autumn, a promise of the harsh winter to come. Corvid's mocking words came back to her. Remember that when the winter winds start to blow. She looked at her small camp, the wagon her only real shelter. It would not be enough. She could not spend another night sleeping on the cold open ground, not with the weather turning. The shack, for all its brokenness, had to become her fortress. With a renewed sense of urgency, she grabbed her father's lantern and her heaviest hammer, and approached the ruin. This was no longer an intellectual exercise. It was a matter of survival. She stepped through the empty doorway, the lantern held high. Her work outside had made the interior seem even more daunting. The floor was a mess of packed earth, animal droppings, and years of accumulated filth. Gaping holes in the roof promised a cold, wet night. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, a lonely, desolate sound. Her light fell upon the one corner of the single room that was different from the rest. The section where the floorboards remained, buckled and sunken. In her first assessment, she had dismissed it as rot, a place where the foundation had failed. Now, it seemed less like a failure and more like a wound. Disappointment, sharp and familiar, pricked at her. The place was a lost cause. The work was too much. Gideon Vale's words were just the ramblings of an old man. Hope was a fool's game. She sank down on a relatively stable beam, the weight of her exhaustion and loneliness pressing in on her. She pulled her thin blanket tighter, preparing to spend another miserable night in the wagon, the sound of the wind whistling through the ruin like a funeral dirge for her own foolish ambitions. What had she been thinking? Coming here. This wasn't a beginning, it was an ending. A week bled into the next. Dora did not surrender to the despair that had threatened to consume her. Instead, she worked. She became a creature of labor, her days measured not in hours but in tasks accomplished. Using scavenged planks and the heavy canvas tarp from her wagon, she patched the most egregious holes in the shack's roof. It was clumsy, ugly work, but it was hers. She learned the language of the ruin, the groan of a stressed beam, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the walls. She cleared the interior with a vengeance, sweeping the dirt floor down to a smooth, hard-packed surface. The shack began to feel less like a tomb and more like a shell, a hollow space waiting to be filled. Solomon would often stand in the doorway, his large, liquid eyes following her movements, a silent, steady anchor in her solitary world. She talked to him as she worked, the sound of her own voice a strange comfort in the vast silence. But the one corner of the room remained a persistent, nagging problem. The sunken floorboards. They refused to be ignored. It wasn't just rot. She knew the look of water damage, the way wood softened and crumbled. This was different. The boards were warped, yes, but they were also sunken in a way that defied simple physics. A joist, even a rotted one, should have offered some resistance. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed a piece of the foundation. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky, she found herself kneeling in that corner, the lantern casting a pool of golden light on the troublesome spot. She ran her calloused fingers over the rough, splintered wood. Her touch was a question. And the wood seemed to answer. One of the boards was different. It was shorter than the others, its end cut with a precision that was jarringly out of place amidst the surrounding decay. It wasn't a break, it was a deliberate cut. A saw had made this mark. Curious, she scraped away a thick layer of grime and filth with the edge of her knife, and there, revealed in the flickering lantern light, was a small, crudely carved mark. It was a vev, simple, angular, and undeniably intentional. Her mind immediately went to the old rancher, Gideon Vale. Was this his mark? Had he been here, long ago? The thought was absurd. But the mark was real. It was a detail that refused to fit. It was a misplaced word in the story of the shack's decline, a grammatical error in the language of ruin. It suggested purpose, not accident. It suggested a secret. She sat back on her heels, the lantern light playing across her thoughtful face. She didn't understand what it meant, not yet. But the feeling of despair had been replaced by something else. Something sharp and focused and full of possibility. It was a question mark carved in wood, and she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that she would not rest until she found the answer. The wind outside seemed to whisper a new word. Not failure, but wait. The next morning, the mystery of the carved V was the first thing on her mind. It was a puzzle that occupied her hands as well as her thoughts. She tried to pry at the board with her knife, but the wood was too thick, the fit too snug. She needed leverage. She needed a tool she did not have. The problem gnawed at her as she went about her morning chores, feeding Solomon and tidying her small, organized camp. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. She looked up, startled, to see a familiar figure riding a slow old gray horse out of the morning mist. It was Gideon Vale. He reined in his horse a few yards from her camp, his pale eyes taking in her work, the patched roof, the cleared ground, with a single, sweeping glance. A flicker of something that looked like approval crossed his face before settling back into its usual stoic mask. He had a long, heavy crowbar tied to his saddle with a leather thong. He swung his leg over the horse and slid to the ground with the surprising grace of an old man who had spent his life in the saddle. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Saw you were working," he said, his voice the same rough gravel she remembered. "Thought you might need this." He untied the crowbar and held it out to her. It was heavy, solid, a tool of purpose and power. Dora took it, the cool iron a shock against her warm skin. Their hands didn't touch, but a current of understanding seemed to pass between them. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He just grunted in response, his gaze drifting toward the open doorway of the shack. "Always wondered about that spot," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He nodded his head toward the sunken corner. He followed her inside, his presence filling the small space. He was not a large man, but he carried an aura of quiet authority, of deep-rooted connection to this land. He stood by, watching, as Dora approached the sunken floor. He didn't offer to do the work for her, and she was grateful for that. This was her discovery, her labor to perform. His presence was not an intrusion, but a benediction, a silent encouragement. She knelt, positioning the sharp, flattened tip of the crowbar under the edge of the strange, short board. She pushed. The wood was stubborn, held fast by a century of dirt and rust. She put her whole weight into it, her muscles straining. The old wood groaned in protest. Solomon, drawn by the noise, stuck his head through the doorway, his ears perked forward in curiosity. With a final, wrenching heave, the board splintered and popped loose. Dora fell back, breathing heavily. Beneath it was not the packed earth she expected. Instead, another layer of planking, laid crosswise, greeted her. A false bottom. Gideon Vale let out a slow breath and nodded once, a deep, knowing gesture. "Just as I thought," he said quietly. There was a story here, and he knew some of its verses, but he let her be the one to read it. Together, in a silent partnership, they began to work. Dora used the crowbar, Gideon using his hands to clear away the debris she loosened. The labor was slow, methodical, almost reverent. With each board she pried loose, she felt she was getting closer to something essential, some hidden truth the shack had been guarding. Her hands were learning the secret before her mind could name it. The air grew thick with the smell of old wood and damp earth, the only sounds the scrape of iron, the splintering of planks, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of two people engaged in a common, unspoken purpose. They were peeling back the layers of time, digging toward the heart of a long-forgotten mystery. The second layer of boards came up with a final, satisfying crack, revealing a dark, square cavity in the earth beneath. It was a void, a deliberate emptiness where there should have been solid ground. And nestled in the center of that void, wrapped in a thick, time-brittle sheath of oilcloth, was a heavy iron strongbox. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a family Bible, but it sat in the earth with a profound and undeniable weight. Blooms of orange rust flowered across its surface, but the clasps and the central lock, though pitted, were still intact. A wave of dizziness washed over Dora. The air in the shack suddenly felt thin, electric. She looked from the box to Gideon Vale. The old man's face was unreadable, but his pale eyes held a deep, quiet light. This was it. This was the answer to the riddle. There was no key. Of course there was no key. Secrets like this were not meant to be opened easily. Gideon looked at Dora, a silent question in his eyes. "Your father's hammer?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She walked on unsteady legs to the wagon and retrieved it from the tool chest. The hammer felt both strange and familiar in her hand. The hickory handle was worn smooth, shaped by her father's grip. It was a tool for building, for creating. Now, she would use it to break something open. She returned to the shack and knelt beside the strongbox, the hammer held over the rusted lock. For a long moment, she hesitated. This felt like a violation, a desecration. But it also felt like a birth. With a deep breath, she brought the hammer down. The sound, a sharp, metallic crack, echoed in the small space. She struck it again, and then a third time. The old, corroded metal of the lock assembly fractured, groaned, and broke apart. With trembling hands, Dora lifted the heavy lid. A puff of stale air, smelling of old paper, dry leather, and time itself, escaped from within. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Reverently, she lifted it out. The leather was cracked and dry, but the book was whole. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was not her father's. It was a precise, elegant script. The ink faded from black to a soft brown. The first entry read, "Plat of the Future Township, unnamed, June 12, 1858. Her breath caught in her chest. She turned the page. And another. Map after map, laying out the grid of streets, the public squares, the very foundations of the town of Redemption, all drawn before it had a name. Beneath the ledger was a bundle of documents tied with a faded ribbon. She carefully untied it. The first paper she unfolded contained the original territorial grant water rights for the entire valley, and at the very bottom, folded into a neat, tight square, was a single, heavy sheet of vellum. She unfolded it. It was a deed for 160 acres, the very heart of the land on which the town now stood. And at the bottom, alongside the territorial governor's seal, was the grantee's name: Thomas Mercer. It was a reward for his services as the first surveyor, the man who had laid the groundwork for everything. The land Corvid and the council had stolen from her was in fact the land her father had been given before any of them had ever set foot in this valley. It was all there. The truth, in iron and ink, buried before the town even knew its own name. That night, the world turned white. A blizzard, the first and most violent of the season, descended upon the plains with a silent, malevolent fury. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the shack, testing every one of Dora's clumsy repairs. Snow, fine and sharp as sand, forced its way through the tiniest cracks, covering everything in a layer of cold dust. Dora huddled by her small, precious fire, the iron strongbox at her side. She had the truth, but the truth was cold comfort against the raging storm. She felt impossibly small, a tiny point of warmth in a world of overwhelming, freezing chaos. The wind shrieked, and a section of her patched roof ripped away with a sound like a gunshot. Snow poured in. For a moment, terror seized her. She had unearthed her father's legacy only to be buried alive with it. Then, through the cacophony of the storm, she heard it. A cry. Faint, desperate, human, she grabbed her lantern, wrapping her head and face in a thick wool scarf, and fought her way to the door. The wind nearly tore it from her grasp. Peering into the blinding white maelstrom, she saw a faint, bobbing light. Another cry, closer this time. "Help! Please, help us!" Straining against the gale, Dora raised her own voice, shouting until her throat was raw. "Here, over here." A shape began to emerge from the blizzard. A man, stumbling, half-frozen, leading a single lame horse that was pulling a small, canvas-topped wagon. "My wife," he gasped, his words torn away by the wind. "She's the baby." Without a second's hesitation, Dora plunged into the storm. She helped the man, whose name was Miller, lead the exhausted horse to the meager shelter of the lean-to she had built for Solomon. The mule shifted, making room, his quiet presence a calming influence on the nervous horse. Inside the wagon, a young woman, hugely pregnant, was huddled under a thin blanket with a small, shivering child. They were on their way to a sister's homestead and had been caught completely by surprise. Their fire had gone out. They were freezing to death. Dora's shack was no palace, but it was life. She helped the man carry his wife inside, settling her as close to the fire as was safe. She took the small, whimpering boy and wrapped him in her own warmest blanket, her father's quilt. She gave them what little food she had: hot coffee, bacon, the last of her bread. For 3 days, the world remained a churning vortex of white. Inside the tiny, crowded shack, 4 strangers and a mule became a strange, temporary family. Dora shared everything she had, which was almost nothing, and yet, in that moment, everything. She held the legal and moral claim to the entire town in a box. But in the crucible of the storm, she discovered a different kind of ownership. Looking at the sleeping child, his face rosy and peaceful by the fire's light, she knew she had made a choice. She would not just fight for a piece of paper. She would build something worthy of the legacy her father had truly left her, a caretaker's heart. She was no longer just surviving. She was providing. She was the root, growing in stony ground. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed. It was a place of blinding white silence, the sun glinting off a landscape of pristine, sculpted snow. Miss Miller, the man Dora had rescued, looked at her with an expression of profound gratitude and awe. He was a traveling land agent, a fact that had gone unmentioned in the desperate chaos of their meeting. As Dora, hesitant at first, showed him the contents of the strongbox, his awe turned to stunned disbelief. He spread the old plat maps on the floor, his trained eye tracing the lines, his finger stopping on the signature, the seal. He read the deed, then read it again. "Miss Mercer," he said, his voice hushed with the weight of the discovery. "This isn't just a deed. This is the founding charter. The articles of Genesis for this entire valley. This predates the township, the council, everything. He knew what he had to do. Despite Dora's quiet protests, she was not used to others fighting her battles. He insisted. He rode his now rested horse into a town still digging itself out from the snow, and he went directly to the marshal. News in a small town travels faster than a prairie fire. Within an hour, it seemed the entire population of Redemption was gathered in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold them, and the buzzing curiosity. Mr. Corvid and the other council members were summoned, their faces a mixture of confusion and irritation. Mr. Miller, an objective and unimpeachable outsider, stood before them. He didn't make accusations. He simply laid out the evidence on a dusty billiard table. He unrolled the original plat map, its lines and letters a silent testimony from the past. He presented the territorial water rights, and then, with a quiet and deliberate motion, he laid down the deed. The one granted to Thomas Mercer. A hush fell over the room. The silence was absolute. You could hear the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Corvid stared at the documents, his face turning a pasty, unhealthy white. He sputtered, reaching for arguments. This is irregular. A legal challenge, a forgery. But his words lacked conviction. The truth was there, undeniable, written in faded ink, and sealed with the authority of a government that had existed long before his own petty kingdom. Gideon Vale, who had come down from the high country as if summoned by the news, stood quietly near Dora at the back of the room. He didn't need to say much. "The law's the law," he said, his voice cutting through Corvid's blustering. "And the truth's the truth." It was a simple statement, but it landed with the force of a judge's gavel. The townspeople turned as one to look at Dora. In their eyes, she was no longer the destitute, cast-off woman she had been just weeks ago. They saw her, truly saw her, for the first time, not an outcast, but the quiet, steadfast heir to their own history. The mockery was gone, replaced by a dawning, humbling reverence. Corvid's power, built on a foundation of lies and bluster, had crumbled, undone not by a weapon or a shout, but by a buried truth and the quiet courage of the woman he had tried to erase. The seasons turned. The last of the snow melted, and the prairie bloomed with the fierce, defiant life of spring. The story of Dora Mercer and the founder's strongbox became a new kind underscore of legend in Redemption, a cautionary tale about pride and a testament to the enduring power of truth. The survey shack was no longer a ruin. With the help of Gideon and a few other quiet, respectful townsmen, who came offering a day's labor as a form of apology, it had been transformed. It was a small, solid cabin now, with a new glass window, a tight-fitting door, and a sturdy stone chimney that sent a welcoming plume of smoke into the clear Dakota sky. A small garden was tilled nearby, the neat rows a promise of summer vegetables. People came to her now, not with pity, but with problems. They brought their own deeds to be checked against her master plat maps, their property disputes to be settled by the clear, unambiguous lines her father had drawn. Mr. Corvid, stripped of his authority and his credibility, had quietly sold his interests and moved on, a ghost in the town's recent memory. The new council, a group of humbler, more careful men, approached her with deference, asking for her guidance on a new irrigation ditch, a matter that fell squarely under the water rights she now controlled. She could have been a tyrant. She could have been a baroness, exacting a tax on every transaction, every drop of water. But that wasn't her way. She sold nothing, she gave nothing away. She simply held the truth and administered it with a quiet, even-handed fairness that her father would have recognized. One evening, at golden hour, when the sun's light turned the prairie grasses to amber and copper, Gideon Vale sat with her on the small porch he had helped her build. They watched the light catch the windows of the town below, making it shimmer like a jewel. "You could have been rich," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Sold it all to the railroad when they come through. Walked away with more money than any of us has ever seen. Dora watched a hawk circling high above the valley. She looked at the framed deed, hanging in its place of honor on the wall just inside the door. She thought of the Millers. Safe. She thought of the town, finding a new, quieter footing. Some things aren't for sale, she said, her voice soft but firm. My father left me this land. But I found out he really left me the town to take care of. She had not inherited a property. She had inherited a purpose. She had built her home, and in doing so, had found her place in the world. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet triumph. It's a tale about finding your true inheritance, a reminder that what we are given is often less important than what we choose to do with it. If you were moved by Dora's journey, please let us know with a like or a comment below. And be sure to subscribe for more stories that dig for the truth. We'll see you on the next one.